She had warned them during every visit, but no one ever truly listened, until it was too late. It all started on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. The sky hung low over the sleepy town of Doveshire, thick with autumn clouds and the kind of silence only a small English village could maintain. The Harper family had just moved into the ivy-covered house on Wren Street, a quaint, time-worn cottage with uneven floors and windows that whispered when the wind blew. It seemed peaceful, safe, familiar, until the first knock came. A quiet, almost apologetic tap on the front door. When Margaret Harper opened it, she was met with a woman wrapped in a faded shawl, silver hair neatly pinned, eyes sharp but kind. "Good afternoon," the woman said in a voice that carried both grace and gravity. "I'm Mrs. Holloway. I used to live here many years ago." There was something about her presence that made Margaret pause. Not threatening, just weighty. Like the woman carried more than years on her shoulders. They offered her tea as politeness dictated. She accepted. From that moment, a routine began. Every week on the same day, Mrs. Holloway would return for tea. She always brought biscuits no one else in the family dared eat, old-fashioned, crumbly things dusted with sugar and something bitter underneath. She would sit at the same spot by the kitchen window, her eyes fixed on the garden, and speak in riddles. "This house remembers," she once said, her spoon clinking against the porcelain cup. "It forgets nothing, you know." The Harpers chuckled, politely, amused by the oddities of the elderly. But their youngest son, Jamie, started asking questions. "Why does she always come alone?" he whispered one evening. "Why does she talk like the house is alive?" Margaret brushed it off. The old woman was lonely, perhaps, grieving, but each week her words became more pointed. "There are things buried here, Margaret," she said one stormy afternoon, "things that should never have been locked away." Still, no one took her seriously until the garden started bleeding. Not real blood, of course, but a foul red ooze that bubbled up near the roots of the apple tree after a week of rain. The earth stank of iron and decay. The family called in a plumber, a soil expert, even the local council. No one could explain it. Mrs. Holloway only sipped her tea, watching from the window. "I told you," she murmured, "but now you'll have to see it through." What had started as an odd ritual of tea and small talk had become something else entirely, a warning ignored, a story unraveling. And the Harpers would soon realize that the old woman's presence in their home was not about nostalgia. It was a message, a haunting that spoke not of ghosts, but of truths buried deeper than bones. Before Mrs. Holloway became a fixture in their lives, the Harpers were just trying to start over. Margaret Harper, a former schoolteacher in her late 40s, had grown tired of city life. The sirens, the traffic, the invisible barrier between neighbors. She longed for a place where time moved slowly, where her children could ride their bikes freely, and where the kitchen smelled of something other than microwave meals and burned deadlines. Her husband, Daniel, a freelance copywriter, needed the quiet. After a burnout scare that left him nearly bedridden for weeks, he'd sworn off the corporate grind. He now spent his days at the kitchen table, typing away with a mug of lukewarm coffee and jazz records spinning gently in the background. Then there were the kids. Emma, 14, always had headphones on, always sketching in the margins of her notebooks, and Jamie, only 9, was still wide-eyed, still unbroken by the world. He was the kind of boy who asked questions you couldn't answer. Where does time go when it passes? Or why do houses make noises at night? Their new home in Doveshire was meant to be a sanctuary. Margaret found it by accident, a listing on a quiet forum posted by someone anonymous, without even a phone number. But something about the photos drew her in. The stone walls, the climbing roses, the way the late afternoon light fell on, the wooden staircase. The house felt lived in. Not new, not perfect, but real. Their first few weeks were filled with laughter and dust. They painted the bedrooms, argued about curtain colors, and turned unpacking into a treasure hunt. Jamie discovered a box of old marbles in the attic. Emma claimed the smallest room as her studio and hung up fairy lights. Even the floorboards seemed to creak with approval. Neighbors brought pies and casseroles. Daniel began volunteering at the local library. Margaret planted herbs in the garden, losing herself in the rhythm of pruning and watering. The silence was no longer eerie, it was peaceful. In those early days, life was tender. There was space to breathe. They didn't question the little oddities, the door that stuck only when closed gently, the way the wind echoed differently through the hall after dusk, the faint smell of lavender that came and went with no explanation. These were the charming quirks of an old house, they thought, things to be embraced. And then Mrs. Holloway knocked. She didn't disturb their peace, not at first. In fact, she seemed to add to it. Her voice was calm, her manners pristine. The children found her amusing, and Daniel liked her quiet humor. She became a sort of relic of the town, a connection to its roots. Only Margaret felt it, the stillness that followed her visits. The heaviness in the air after tea was poured, and pleasantries shared. She couldn't explain it. But something had shifted. It was a grey Thursday when everything began to crack. Rain had been falling for 2 days straight, drumming softly against the windows like a lullaby. Margaret was in the kitchen, folding tea towels, when she heard Jamie scream from the garden. Not the scream of a scraped knee or sibling teasing, but something raw, from the gut, pure fear. She ran outside barefoot, the cold mud clinging to her skin, her heart thundering in her chest. Jamie stood frozen near the apple tree, his small hands trembling, his face pale. "There's something in the ground," he whispered. It moved. Margaret followed his gaze. Where he pointed, the soil had split open, not naturally, not like erosion, but torn like a wound, and from it seeped a dark, rust-colored liquid that smelled like metal and rot. The rain had exposed it, a thick sludge that stained the grass in streaks of red. Daniel rushed out next, slipped, swore. He tried to scoop some of the substance into a jar for testing, but the moment it touched plastic, it curdled into a black paste. "Could be a burst pipe," he muttered, more to himself than anyone. But the doubt in his eyes betrayed him. Later that evening, they sat around the table in silence. The fireplace crackled, but the warmth didn't reach their bones. Emma wouldn't speak. Jamie refused to eat. Even Daniel, normally the voice of reason, was unusually quiet. That's when the knock came. 3 slow, deliberate taps. Mrs. Holloway. She was dry despite the rain, and her shawl didn't have a single drop of moisture. Her eyes scanned the room before she said anything. "I told you," she murmured, lowering herself into her usual chair. "I warned you about the garden." Margaret's hands clenched the edge of the table. "Warned us? About what? You kept speaking in riddles, Mrs. Holloway. What is going on?" Mrs. Holloway stirred her tea slowly. "It's not what's in the ground that's dangerous. It's what put it there." The air in the kitchen seemed to thicken. Time slowed. The clock ticked louder. She continued, voice steady. "There was a man who lived here. Before the war, a recluse. He had ideas, terrible ones. He believed the earth could remember pain, absorb it. He did things to people, and he buried what he couldn't face, right under that tree." Margaret felt the blood drain from her. "Face? Are you saying?" "I'm saying that some houses aren't haunted by spirits. They're haunted by what people choose to forget." Outside, thunder rumbled. The apple trees swayed violently despite the stillness of the wind. And for the first time, Margaret realized the house, the home she had fallen in love with, was not merely old, it was wounded, and wounds that don't heal fester. The days that followed were anything but normal. Margaret stopped tending the garden. The herbs withered from neglect, the rosemary browning at the tips, the mint overtaken by weeds. Every time she looked out the window and saw the apple tree, something twisted in her chest, not fear exactly, but unease, deep and lingering. Daniel became obsessed with research. He buried himself in the town's archives, visited the library daily, asked strange questions to the elderly locals. Each night, he returned home with a stack of yellowed newspapers and fading photographs, hands stained with dust, eyes sunken. Emma stopped drawing. Her sketchbooks, once filled with portraits and trees, now lay abandoned under her bed. One afternoon, Margaret found a page half torn, depicting a tree with hands reaching up from beneath its roots. Emma had no memory of drawing it, and Jamie changed the most. He no longer asked questions. He stopped sleeping in his own bed. At night, he would stand by his parents' door in silence, staring until one of them noticed. When Margaret asked him what was wrong, he would only shake his head and whisper, "It's listening." The house, once warm and echoing with laughter, grew quiet. Still, the creaks in the floorboards no longer sounded charming. They were rhythmic now, like footsteps. There were cold spots in the hall. Lights flickered without explanation. Mrs. Holloway continued her visits every Thursday, without fail, but now she came not as a guest, but as a guide. Her tone changed, less cryptic, more resigned. She spoke of energy, of memory, of places that collect sorrow like dust. She said the house was not evil, but bruised, and bruises, she warned, often ache the most when touched. "Your son feels it most," she told Margaret one evening. "Children often do. Their hearts haven't built walls yet." Margaret wanted to believe it was just stress, the move, the weather, a bizarre coincidence, but denial is a fragile shield, and hers was cracking. The smell from the garden grew, stronger. The red substance, once dismissed as sludge, kept resurfacing. No matter how many times they tried to dig it up or cover it with gravel, it returned. One night, Margaret woke to the sound of Jamie crying, not from his room, but from the garden. She rushed outside, heart pounding, only to find him standing by the tree again, barefoot in the cold, tears streaking his cheeks. "I don't want it to whisper anymore," he said. She pulled him close, but in her arms he felt like something fading, like a memory she was about to lose. That night, for the first time, Margaret didn't sleep. She stayed awake, watching the walls breathe, listening to the sighs of the house, and wondering if Mrs. Holloway had been right all along. The Becky house wasn't haunted, it was grieving. Margaret stood at the edge of the garden, her boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. Dawn was just breaking, casting pale light over the twisted branches of the apple tree. For weeks, she had watched her family unravel, piece by piece, like threads pulled from a fraying sweater, while she held it together with forced smiles and silent prayers. But not today. Today, something inside her shifted. She wasn't sure if it was the way Jamie had spoken the night before, distant, like he wasn't fully there, or the silence in Emma's eyes, once so full of fire. Maybe it was Daniel, who now talked about energies and resonances with a manic gleam in his eyes. Whatever it was enough. "I won't lose them," she whispered. She found herself at Mrs. Holloway's door that morning, not waiting for Thursday, not asking politely. She knocked with a force that surprised even her. The older woman opened the door slowly, already dressed, as if she'd been expecting her. "I need to know everything," Margaret said. "No riddles, no poetry, just the truth." Mrs. Holloway nodded solemnly and gestured her inside. The conversation that followed unfolded like an old letter finally opened. Mrs. Holloway spoke of her own past, how she had grown up in that same house, how she too had once heard the whispers, how her brother had vanished one summer without a trace, and how her parents had turned cold, distant, broken. "It feeds on what is unspoken," she explained. "Regret, shame, grief buried too deep to name." Margaret asked, "So what do we do? Move? Burn it down?" The old woman shook her head. "You face it, you acknowledge it, you bring what was buried back into the light." That night, Margaret did something she had never dared before. She invited her family into the living room, all of them together, with candles lit and no distractions. She told them the full story, what she'd learned from Mrs. Holloway, what the town record said, the truth about the man who had lived in their house before them. Emma listened with wide eyes. Daniel sat motionless. Jamie curled into her side, clutching her hand, and then Margaret spoke of their own pain. The miscarriages she had hidden, the financial collapse they narrowly escaped, the isolation she'd felt even surrounded by love. The house, she realized, had simply mirrored what they refused to say. There was silence after she finished. Not cold silence, but stillness, like something ancient had finally been acknowledged. And in that moment, Jamie looked up and whispered, "It's quieter now." It wasn't over, but it was a beginning. The next morning, the garden smelled only of damp leaves. The red sludge was gone. For the first time in weeks, sunlight broke through the clouds. Margaret had chosen to stop running, and in doing so, she had reclaimed her home, not from ghosts, but from silence. Time didn't rush back in like a flood. It trickled. Weeks passed. The garden slowly healed. The grass around the apple tree grew again, shy at first, like it wasn't sure it belonged. Birds returned to perch on the branches. The air in the house lightened, as if the walls had exhaled after years of holding something in. Margaret noticed the change in the small things. Jamie began sleeping through the night again. He no longer stood at their bedroom door. He started asking questions. Once more, not about fear or whispers, but about nature, stars, and how long it takes to grow a tree. Emma began sketching again. One day, she placed a drawing on the fridge. A woman in a shawl sitting by a window, a soft smile on her lips, the light from the garden falling across her hands. Daniel returned to his writing, but now it was different, slower, more honest. He wrote a short story about a house that wept in the rain and a family that learned to listen. He submitted it to a local magazine. They published it. Mrs. Holloway stopped visiting every week. Margaret noticed it one Thursday. No knock, no biscuits, just silence. She waited the next week, nothing. A month passed. One morning, she walked to the address where she'd once knocked so desperately, only to find the windows shuttered and the house vacant. No one had seen her in days. Some said she'd moved to a care home. Others claimed she had always lived, alone, in a house that had been abandoned for years. But Margaret knew better. Seasons turned. Autumn faded into winter. Snow fell over Wren Street like a soft eraser, covering memories and scars. The Harper family adjusted to the rhythm of the village, to its slow mornings and lingering sunsets. The house creaked, but now it felt like conversation, not warning. The whispers were gone. Every year, on the first Thursday of October, Margaret made a pot of tea and placed it by the window, 2 cups. One for her, one for Mrs. Holloway. She never drank them both. Jamie grew tall, his curiosity never dimming. Emma graduated and left for art school, her sketches now filled with trees, old houses, and women watching over them. Daniel began giving, writing workshops to local teens. The house changed, but subtly. It stayed old. The floorboards still groaned, but it no longer felt like it was waiting for something to end. Instead, it felt like it had finally begun. Margaret would sometimes stand in the garden, now blooming again, and feel something brush past her in the wind. A memory, maybe, a thank you, or simply peace. The past had not disappeared. It had simply been witnessed, and in that witnessing, the house and the family within it had been freed. It happened 5 years later. Margaret was cleaning the attic, a space she had carefully avoided since the early days in the house. But now, with Jamie off to college and Emma preparing for an exhibition in London, the quiet was too heavy, and her hands needed something to do. The attic was musty, filled with forgotten boxes and dust. But in the far corner, behind an old trunk, something caught her eye. a loose floorboard, slightly raised, as if it had been disturbed recently. She hesitated, heart pounding in a rhythm she hadn't felt in years. When she pried it up, she found a small metal box, rusted shut, but not locked. Inside were letters, dozens of them written in an elegant, careful hand, each one addressed to "My dearest Thomas." She sat on the attic floor and read the first one, then another, and another. They weren't from Mrs. Holloway. They were to her, from a man named Edwin Wren, the same name Daniel had once uncovered in the town archives. The recluse, the man who had lived in the house before the war. But these letters weren't confessions of cruelty. They were love letters, filled with guilt, sorrow, and something else, fear. He spoke of the rituals they made me witness, of the roots that writhe beneath, and of his decision to hide the truth, not just to protect himself, but to shield her. Mrs. Holloway, she had been his beloved, and she had returned years later not as a neighbor, but as a keeper of what had been buried, a witness to what had gone wrong, a woman who carried the grief of a man who had tried to repent, but had done so in silence. Tears ran down Margaret's cheeks. She descended the attic slowly, carrying the box like it might break the moment she let it go. That night, she placed the letters on the kitchen table. Daniel read them first, then Emma when she came to visit. Together, they decided to give the story an ending. They hosted a gathering at the house, invited the neighbors, told the story, not just their own, but Edwin's, Mrs. Holloway's, the pain and the love that had soaked into the walls. They planted a tree beside the old apple tree, a young oak, and beneath its roots, they buried the letters, sealed, in a wooden box wrapped in linen, with a single teacup placed on top. As they covered the soil, the wind rose gently, lifting Margaret's hair. For a moment, she felt the warmth of sunlight on her shoulders and the scent of lavender, unmistakable, drifting from nowhere. She turned to look at the house, and in the window, for the briefest second, she saw her, Mrs. Holloway, smiling. And then she was gone. But her legacy remained, not one of fear, but of memory, of love long misunderstood, and of a silence finally broken. Some houses don't need to speak to be heard. They creak, they groan, they breathe, not from age, but from memory. They hold on to what we don't say, and sometimes, when we least expect it, they give it back to us. Margaret Harper often thought about that, especially in the quiet mornings, tea in hand, sun cutting across the kitchen floor like golden threads. Life had not been perfect since the day she first saw the red soil in her garden. It had been fragile, uncertain, but also real, and that was enough. She had learned that silence is not always peace. Sometimes silence is where pain hides. Her family had not escaped the past. They had walked into it, faced it, dug it up with their own hands, and in doing so, they had rewritten its ending. The story wasn't about a haunted house. It was about how easily we bury things, our regrets, our grief, the words we think will hurt too much to say, and how those things never truly disappear. They wait, in walls, in shadows, in the pauses between our sentences. But healing doesn't come from pretending. It comes from naming, from sitting across the table like Margaret had with Mrs. Holloway and asking, "Tell me the truth," and then listening. If Margaret had ignored that first warning, the strange, fragile words from a woman she barely knew, what would have become of her family? What would have become of her son, her daughter, her marriage? She never found out what happened to Mrs. Holloway in the end. No records, no obituary, no trace, but maybe that's how it was meant to be. Some people are messengers. Their purpose is to wake us up, to shake us gently from the sleep of forgetting. And maybe the greatest haunting of all is not from ghosts, but from the lives we never fully lived because we were too afraid to feel. Everything we needed to feel. The house still stood, weathered but strong. It still made sounds at night. But now, those sounds weren't warnings. They were echoes, not of sorrow, but of survival. Margaret often told the story to visitors who stayed too long after dinner. She didn't embellish it. She didn't need. But the truth was strange enough, and at the end, she always said the same thing. Listen to your house. It remembers more than you think. Just make sure it remembers love. Because memory lives not only in the minds of people, but in the places where they dared to feel something deeply. And sometimes, the scariest thing we can do is simply listen. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to leave a like below. What did you think of the ending? Would you have done something different? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment and share your ideas with us. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you don't miss out on more stories like this one.